Hey everyone, I'm here today to tell you about the kidneys, my absolute favorite organ in the human body. Now you may be asking yourself, Dr. Ball, why are you dressed like a superhero today? Well, that's because the kidneys are the superhero of the human body. They do everything. They help regulate ion concentration, water concentration, osmolarity of the blood, the pH of the blood volume, blood pressure. They're getting rid of toxic components. They make hormones. The kidneys do everything, and they're necessary for you to survive. So let's start first by going over some of the anatomy in the kidneys and in these structures that are known as the nephrons. It's really important to understand the anatomy before we can understand how they function to help filter our blood. Okay, so let's look at this kidney here first. So it has a red and a blue arrow. That is for the blood vessels that are going into and out of the kidney. So the kidneys are regulating and filtering blood, so obviously they need a lot of blood supply so that they can do that. The blood coming in is coming in through the renal artery. And the blood that has been filtered and is leaving the kidney is leaving through the renal vein. Notice this word renal that refers to the kidneys. That's what this R stands for, obviously. So the kidneys, if we do a cross-section through them, they have an outer region that's known as the renal cortex and an inner region known as the renal medulla. So following the same sort of naming pattern that we've seen before in other organs like the adrenal gland. Right, so the outside part here is known as the renal cortex. The inside is the renal medulla. Okay, and so inside of our kidney we have these tubes here, which are called nephrons. And so blood will go into these tubes. And any molecules that we want to get rid of in the urine are going to just flow through these tubes, through these nephrons, and collect in this area here, which is known as the renal pelvis. Okay, so that's basically where you start to make urine. So everything you want to get rid of out of the body, out of the blood, is going to be going into the renal pelvis first, and then into the urine. Okay, so the renal pelvis is just collecting all of that, and then from there it leaves through this tube, which is known as the ureter. And from there it's going to go to the bladder where we store it, and then eventually you'll be released out of the body as urine. Okay, so that's just kind of a big scale view of the kidney anatomy. Now we need to zoom in on one of these tubes here, which is again known as the nephron. And there's like millions of these tubes in one kidney. So everything that we see here is happening in parallel throughout the entire kidney. All right, so now let's look at our nephron. So it has blood, that's the red and the blue part here, so indicating oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And then we also have this black tube here, which is our nephron. Okay, it's also known as a tubule. Okay, so you can call it a tubule. So let's look at the blood first. So coming off of the renal artery, it will split into arterioles and then into capillaries. So this blood vessel coming in here into our nephron is an arteriole. It's known as the afferent arteriole. Remember, the word afferent means going towards. In the past, we talked about it in terms of the nervous system, like sensory neurons or afferent neurons. Here, we're talking about it going towards the nephron. Okay, so it's an afferent arteriole. All right, what comes after the arteriole? Capillaries, right? So this is a capillary. It's like a ball of capillaries. It's known as the glomerulus. Okay, so that's a capillary. What comes after capillaries? Venules, right? Okay, but not in this case, actually. So in this case, it's another arteriole. It's known as the efferent arteriole. It's leaving the nephron, right, or leaving the glomerulus. So this is our efferent arteriole. Right, so the blood comes in here into the glomerulus. This process known as filtration occurs. That's when some of the material from the blood will enter into the tubule. And then from there, everything that didn't go into the tubule is going to continue on into our next blood vessel, which is the efferent arteriole. And then from there, it goes into a second capillary. This is unusual, right? Normally, it goes into a venule and a vein and returns back to the heart, but here we have two capillaries in a row. The glomerulus first, and then the second set here, which is called the peritubular capillary. And then the peritubular capillary kind of merges into this big capillary network around here, which is known as the vasorecta. Put it over here. Okay, so the vasorecta is also a capillary. So it's not really 3 capillaries in a row. It's more that there's this one here, the glomerulus, and then there's a second set of capillaries, which is called towards the top region here, towards the renal cortex. This is the peritubular capillary, and then that just merges into this other one down here into the medulla, which is the vasorecta. And actually, while I'm here, why don't I label that? So this is the cortex, and this is the medulla. Just to put it in perspective to what we have over there. Okay, so what's it called when we have 2 capillaries in a row like that? We've seen this once before. Do you guys remember? So it's called a portal system. So this is our second example of a portal system. The first example was in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Okay, so we've labeled our blood vessels. Throughout this whole process in the capillaries, they're giving oxygen to the cells here, these epithelial cells. And so eventually we have deoxygenated blood, and then this is going to go to the renal vein. Okay, so this is actually a venule, and then it goes into the vein and then back to the heart. Okay, so that's our blood system. Now let's look at our tubes here. So I mentioned that the blood will leave the capillary in the glomerulus and get filtered into the nephron, right, into this tube here. So this is called filtration. Trying to figure out where exactly to fit that in. Filtration, we'll say. Okay, so small molecules, water, salts, glucose, sugars, amino acids, things that are small can move from the glomerulus into the nephron, but large things do not. So proteins do not enter the nephron, and red blood cells definitely do not enter the nephron. So those should stay in the blood. Okay, so what is this first part of the nephron called? It's called Bowman's capsule. Okay, so it just wraps around the glomerulus, and anything, again, that's small, that's coming out of the blood will enter into Bowman's capsule. So named after, presumably, the person who discovered that. Okay, so Bowman's capsule right there. And then from there, the liquid in the nephron is called the filtrate. So the filtrate goes through these kind of wiggly tubes up here in the cortex. That's known as the proximal convoluted tubule, or we'll just call it the proximal tubule. Okay, so that's here, so proximal tubule. Okay, and then let's just follow this liquid down. So now it's going to go through this loop here, right? It goes down this loop, dips down into the medulla, and then back out again. Okay, so this is known as the loop of Henle, dipping down into the renal medulla. And you can further categorize that as the descending limb. So this is the descending limb of the loop of Henle. Liquid's going down into the interior of the kidney. And then this is the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Okay, so now it's going to go through this other kind of horizontal tube here, and that is known as the distal convoluted tubule, or you can just call it distal tubule. So let's call it that. Okay, so this is our distal tubule. So that's this whole region in here. Okay, so the filtrate is going this direction, and then the filtrate enters what's known as the collecting duct here. Okay, so this is the collecting duct. And notice that I have this extra little branch here, and that's because a nephron over here can actually share the same collecting duct. So all the material that is eventually going to make up the urine can be collected in collecting ducts from multiple nephrons. And then whatever comes out of here is going to go to the renal pelvis. And at this point, we would call this urine. Okay, so that's the nephron. I know it's a little complicated with all of these names here, but different functions happening at different places along the nephron, so it is actually important to know the different names of the parts of the nephron. There's one other thing that I want to just point out, which is that in between the kind of like the afferent arteriole, Bowman's capsule, and the distal tubule right up here, there are these specialized cells that release an enzyme called renin, which we'll talk about later on. It's important for regulating blood pressure. So I just want to just kind of mention this part here. So it's like right between the distal tubule and the afferent arteriole, and it has a special name. It's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Juxtaglomerular apparatus. All right, that means next to the glomerulus, which it is kind of, right? Okay, so let me just talk you through that one more time. Just it's a little complicated here. So inside the kidney, we have tons of these tubes, right? And these nephron tubes. This is like one unit, a nephron. We have millions of them in a kidney. And for each one of our nephrons, we have blood coming in through an arteriole. It's called an afferent arteriole. And then some of the material then goes into the glomerulus and gets filtered into the nephron. Okay, so the glomerulus is a capillary, a leaky capillary. And then from there, the blood that was not filtered is going to go into the efferent arteriole, and then into these capillaries, the peritubular capillary and the vasorectum. And then they'll come back together into a venule and then back to the renal vein. Okay, so that's what's going on with the blood. And I should mention along this entire pathway, there is still exchange between the capillaries and the nephron. So, for example, we have things, I don't know, going this direction. It's called reabsorption. So going from the nephron back into the blood, right? We don't, like, filtration is not specific. Just anything that's small gets put into the nephron. And so then we're going to, like, take some of that back and put it back into the blood in a more regulated way. In addition, there might be a few things that didn't make it in for filtration, and so those can be secreted from the blood back into the nephron. So there's all this communication going on between these capillaries and the nephron along the entire way. Okay, so anyway, back to here. So we have some materials going into Bowman's capsule, and then that makes up the filtrate. The filtrate travels through the proximal tubule, the loop of Henle goes down, and then back up, and then the distal tubule here, and then the collecting duct. And anything that's left at that point is urine, and it's going to go to the renal pelvis and then out through the ureter and then to the bladder. Okay, so that's the anatomy of the kidney. Definitely practice drawing your nephron. Every time you see a nephron drawing, it's in a slightly different orientation, so it'd be really helpful just for you to look up other images of this, look on the module for other images and see if you can understand how to label it. And so then in the next pages, we'll learn more about the functions of the nephron and what exactly is being reabsorbed at each segment here of the nephron.